Now, back to Game On.
By 1985, video games were history. But at the Consumer Electronics Show that year, tucked away in a small booth, was the company that brought the world Donkey Kong, Nintendo. The Japanese game maker was exhibiting its latest product, the Famicom, a video game console. The video game business may have died in America, but it was alive and well in Japan. In fact, Nintendo had sold 3 million Famicoms there. Still, that didn't matter much stateside.
All of the buyers thought, this is really slick, really neat, but they would not touch it, even if we guaranteed the sale. They said it's too risky.
Not wanting to scare off any more American retailers than it already had, the company stopped calling the Famicom a video game machine and renamed it the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES. For good measure, they also added a decoy.
We came up with a robot so that we could tell buyers, and they in turn could tell their superiors, that this was not just a video game system, it was a robotic video game system or some nonsense like that. And it worked.
What didn't work for Nintendo President Hiroshi Yamauchi were the test market plans.
We as Americans were saying, well, you'd go to some place like Peoria or wherever they test market products. And he thought that was crazy. He said, I'll give you one chance. You got one shot. You try to introduce this in New York City. And if you can make it work there, then we'll go from there.
During Christmas 1985, Nintendo sold 50,000 units in New York, enough to prove that there was still a market in America for video games. And what really helped sell the NES was the video game included with it, a home version of Nintendo's Japanese arcade blockbuster, Super Mario Bros.
If you saw Super Mario Bros. On the NES, it didn't look a thing like anything you saw on an old Atari machine. It looked like the arcade game. It had vibrant colors. It had distinct images. Mario looked like a person. He didn't look like a stick figure. You saw clouds and mushrooms and creatures.
It all paid off. In a poll taken a year later, kids across the country were asked what they wanted most for Christmas. Their number one choice? The NES. By 1988, Nintendo had a whopping 90% share of the video game market.
Let's play Nintendo!
The company's domination of the industry got even bigger when it introduced its video game equivalent of Sony's Walkman. And Nintendo had none other to thank for its success than Mikhail Gorbachev. Well, sort of. Right at the end of the Cold War, a Soviet computer engineer named Alexei Pajitnov created a puzzle game called Tetris. When the Iron Curtain lifted, Nintendo got its first look at Tetris and started talking rubles.
And we knew that that could be the killer game on Game Boy, the launch title.
Even with that tiny monochrome screen on a Game Boy, you could show the blocks very efficiently for Tetris. You could distinguish, the shapes and everything, and it was perfect. It was a perfect coupling.
Thanks to Tetris, Game Boy became an instant hit, selling 32 million units in its first 3 years. Nintendo seemed unbeatable.
There is a new addiction in America. Nintendo video games, more than a pastime, more than a passing fancy. For many, a kind of narcotic.
But at that very moment in time, Nintendo's days as the only game in town were numbered.
The new generation of kids were ready to play games again. Those who had played wanted to come back in. Sega saw this and said, there's room for more than one player in the market. If Nintendo can do it, Sega can do it.
A veteran executive of Coleco, Mattel, and Atari, Michael Katz became president of Sega's American division in 1989, just as the company was about to roll out the Genesis game console to replace its unsuccessful Master System.
When I joined Sega, I was told that the only Japanese I would be expected to know was the phrase Yakumandai. And I said, that's interesting. What does it mean? And I was told it meant 1 million units. So that became my marching orders, that became the prayer that I was supposed to give every morning when I woke up and every evening when I went to sleep.
Genesis puts you in the game with the
To help answer his prayers, Katz went after athletes like Joe Montana to star in games for the Genesis. And he initiated a no-holds-barred ad campaign.
We had to do something drastic. We had to hit hard. We had to go after that 90% of the market. It was Nintendo.
What Nintendo? By 16.
Unfortunately, Genesis didn't do as well in America as Sega Japan had hoped.
Ultimately, we only did half a yuck. When I was at Sega, we did 500,000 units.
Out went Michael Katz as president of Sega America, and in charged Tom Kalinske, an executive from Mattel. Before long, Sega had a new hero. No, not Tom Kalinske, Sonic the Hedgehog.
One of the things we bragged about was how fast we could have action on our system, how fast we could move sprites around on the system. And so Sonic was designed to be a very fast-moving character.
And they just did very, very edgy ads.
Hey! You still don't have a Sega CD? What are you waiting for, Nintendo to make one?
The consumer was left with the impression that, you know, if you were cool, you used a Sega system, and if you were a 5-year-old kid, you used a Nintendo system.
All of a sudden, the share started going up, and we went from, you know, literally single-digit share to double-digit share to 20% share to 30% share. At that point, I knew we had arrived.
Yakumandai, 1 million units, was no longer a prayer. It became a reality several times over. By 1992, Sega had captured 55% of the console market. Sonic had beaten Mario, and while the plumber and the hedgehog would challenge each other to rematch after rematch, lurking in the wings was a giant who would ultimately trample them both.
Coming up, a new player in the video game called PlayStation.
Sony was saying, look, this is going to replace the PC. It's going to replace the DVD player.
But another technology giant had other ideas. That's next, as Game On continues.